I used to think I knew everything about Liza. We'd been married for 20 years, building a life together. Our little home in Tallinn was supposed to be the symbol of everything we'd worked for. She was my partner, my best friend. At least, that's what I thought. But over time, things started to change. It wasn't immediate, just small things at first. Liza became more distant. Late nights out for her dance classes, which she'd always enjoyed, but it started to feel different. I'd wait up for her, but when she came home, she seemed off, flushed, hair messed up in a way that didn't look like a workout. Every time I asked her about the classes, she'd brush me off with short answers, like she was hiding something. And then there was Victor, her dance instructor. She'd mention him more often, but it was the way she said his name. Like she was trying to downplay it, but something in her voice didn't sit right. "Victor's such a great teacher, Richard," she'd say, but there was always a flicker in her eyes when she did. She was always telling me about him, how he pushed her to be better, but I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more there. I told myself I was just paranoid. Maybe I was overthinking things. But you know that feeling when something's wrong? That gut instinct. I couldn't ignore it anymore. So one Friday, after another of her dance classes, I decided to follow her. I didn't want to be that guy, the one who doesn't trust his wife, but I had to know. I watched her drive off and followed at a distance. I didn't expect to find anything, but my gut was screaming. When she pulled into the parking lot of the studio, I stayed hidden. And then I saw it. Liza and Victor standing too close. Laughing, touching, the kind of familiarity that shouldn't exist between a married woman and her dance instructor. My heart dropped when they kissed. It wasn't a friendly kiss, it was intimate, full of intention. They were tangled up in each other, lost in a moment I wasn't part of. I felt sick, numb. My whole world was crumbling, but I didn't move. I didn't confront them. I just watched, my stomach in knots. I don't remember how I got home. I don't remember walking in the door. But when Liza came back an hour later, acting like nothing had changed, like I hadn't just watched her betray me, I didn't say a word. I knew something was off, but I needed time to figure out what to do. The betrayal wasn't just about the kiss, it was everything that led up to it, the lies she'd been living. And I realized, this wasn't a random affair. It was something planned, something deeper. I had to process it all. But one thing was clear. I wasn't going to let this slide. That night, I barely slept. My mind wouldn't stop racing. The image of Liza and Victor kissing, her arms wrapped around him, kept replaying in my head. I couldn't believe it. All those years, the trust, the life we'd built, it had all been a lie. It wasn't just the affair that cut deep. It was everything. The secrecy, the lies, the way she'd slowly pulled away from me without a single explanation. The next morning, Liza acted like nothing had happened. She kissed me on the cheek, asked about my day, and even offered to make breakfast. The casual way she behaved, like the night before was nothing, made my stomach churn. I could see the uncertainty in her eyes though. She was waiting for me to say something, to confront her. But I wasn't going to. Not yet. I wasn't going to let her think I was just reacting out of hurt. I needed a plan. I had to be smart. I started with Victor. Who was this guy who had wormed his way into my life? He wasn't just a dance instructor. He was a predator, and I was going to expose him. A quick search gave me what I needed. Victor wasn't some innocent guy. He had a history of using his charm and position to manipulate women. There were whispers about other relationships he'd been involved in, rumors about him using women for his own gain. It didn't take long to find more. I dug through old records, talked to people who'd known him. He had a pattern, and it was obvious now. He targeted women like Liza, who were looking for validation, for something more. And he used that to get what he wanted. With all this new information, I started to build my case against him. I wasn't just going to let this guy get away with it. I had to make sure he didn't just hurt me. He had to pay for what he'd done to others, too. I gathered photos, documents, anything that could expose him for what he really was. But I wasn't just focused on Victor. No, my revenge needed to be more than just taking him down. Liza had to feel the weight of what she'd done, too. I didn't want to confront her yet. I wasn't going to give her the satisfaction of seeing me broken. Instead, I started to build something far more destructive. I was going to tear apart her perfect little world, piece by piece. I didn't just want to expose the affair. I wanted to expose everything. The lies, the manipulation. I wanted the world to see who Liza really was, not the woman she'd pretended to be. The woman who had kept her secrets hidden while deceiving everyone around her. So, I began to work in silence, gathering the pieces of my plan. It wasn't just about revenge. It was about taking back control. It was about showing Liza and Victor what happens when you betray someone who truly loved you. I wasn't going to yell. I wasn't going to beg. I was going to make them both regret this. I couldn't shake the image of Victor and Liza. It haunted me, clinging to my thoughts like a storm cloud. But instead of breaking down, I turned that pain into fuel. I wasn't going to let this slide. If Liza wanted to betray me, she was going to feel the consequences in ways she couldn't even imagine. I started by diving deeper into Victor's life. He might have thought he could charm his way into someone else's marriage without repercussions, but he had no idea who he was dealing with. Victor wasn't as spotless as he seemed. No one is. I used every tool at my disposal. Public records, old photos, whispers from the dance community. The story that started to unfold was darker than I expected. I discovered Victor had been involved in a string of questionable relationships with his students. It wasn't just Liza. There were others, women who'd been vulnerable, looking for something in their lives, and he'd taken full advantage. Some were married, some were younger than they should have been. He was always careful, keeping his name clean on the surface. But the more I dug, the more I found cracks in his facade. There was even an incident with a former student that had almost led to a lawsuit, but it was buried quietly, swept under the rug. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. This was about exposing a predator. Liza might have made her choices, but Victor? He'd done this before, and he'd do it again. I wasn't going to let him walk away unscathed. But I couldn't just go public yet. I needed to gather more. Every piece of dirt I found had to be perfect, undeniable. And while I worked, I kept up the act at home. I didn't let Liza suspect a thing. If she noticed me being quieter than usual, she didn't comment. Maybe she thought I was too blind or too broken to figure it out. Let her think that, I told myself. It made my job easier. One evening, I asked her about her dance class. I pretended to be supportive, asking if she wanted me to come along one day, watch her practice. Her eyes widened for just a moment before she quickly masked her reaction with a smile. "Oh, you'd be so bored, Richard," she said, laughing it off. "It's just basic routines." She was lying, and we both knew it. But I didn't press her. Not yet. Instead, I started laying the groundwork for something bigger. Victor's charm had won over more than just Liza. He had a tight circle of followers, students who adored him. I began to track their connections, their stories, their online presence. Some posted about how inspiring he was, while others hinted at past drama that seemed too carefully ignored. Piece by piece, I built the framework for my revenge. It wasn't just about confrontation. This had to be thorough, deliberate, and absolute. Victor wasn't going to see it coming. And as for Liza, her turn would come soon enough. When I looked in the mirror, I saw someone different staring back at me. Betrayal had changed me, but it hadn't broken me. If anything, it had sharpened my resolve. And that was just the beginning. As the days dragged on, I kept up the quiet facade. Liza was still acting like everything was normal, still offering her smiles and small talk, pretending like I wasn't watching her every move. And Victor, he was still playing his role as the charming dance instructor. I could see the way he'd smile at her in class, a smile that had started to feel like a personal insult. But I wasn't going to make a move too soon. I wasn't going to give them the satisfaction of seeing me unravel. Instead, I started making the connections. Victor wasn't the only piece to this puzzle. Liza was just as guilty. She'd built this perfect image of herself, the caring wife, the dedicated mother, the woman everyone admired. But I knew the truth now. She wasn't any of those things. She was a liar, a manipulator, and she'd spent years hiding her true self behind a mask of kindness. It wasn't hard to find dirt on her, either. Liza had carefully curated her online life, but nothing's perfect. Social media is a funny thing. It's full of cracks, places where things slip through. Old posts, old photos, bits of her past that didn't fit the perfect wife narrative. I knew what I needed to do with them. I wasn't just going to expose the affair. No, I was going to tear down her entire image. I started by gathering everything I could. I went through her old photos, messages, even things she thought I'd never see. Texts with friends where she laughed about how she could get away with anything because of how good she was at hiding things. I found notes from years ago, things that hinted at her desires for a different life, a life where she wasn't tied down by our marriage. She had dreams of escaping, of being free, of doing whatever she wanted without consequences. It wasn't just about Victor. He was a symptom of a much bigger problem. As I collected the pieces, I realized something. I wasn't just going to destroy her world. I was going to expose her as the person she truly was. The woman who lied, who used me and everyone around her to get what she wanted. I wasn't going to just show her affair. I was going to show the world the real Liza. I kept playing my part at home. I didn't let on that I knew anything. In fact, I started to be more supportive of her dancing. I'd ask about Victor in casual conversation, pretending I was interested. It made her uncomfortable, but she didn't question it. She thought I was too clueless, too hurt to do anything. It made the whole thing easier. But behind the scenes, I started creating the narrative. I began drafting posts, carefully crafted messages that would undermine her perfect life. I started planting little seeds of doubt, cryptic social media posts, edited images that hinted at something darker, something far more manipulative than the affair. It wasn't just about exposing the truth. It was about framing the story. I couldn't wait to watch everything unravel. I knew that soon, the world would see Liza for what she really was. And it wasn't going to be pretty. The pieces were falling into place. Victor, Liza, the lies, they were all part of the bigger picture now. I wasn't driven by rage anymore. That initial shock had passed. This wasn't about making them regret their actions in the moment. It was about leaving them with scars that would last forever. I knew patience was key. I had to stay calm, keep up the act at home, pretend everything was fine. Liza still thought I was clueless, still tried to play the part of the loving wife. Every time she mentioned Victor or dance class, I'd nod, smile, pretend I was just another supportive husband. She didn't know how much I was watching, how every word she said made my blood boil. Behind the scenes, I began to work my way into their world, setting the stage for something bigger. I started making subtle adjustments to my own online presence. Nothing obvious, just enough to plant doubt. I followed people who could tie back to Victor's past, people who knew about his history of manipulation and failed relationships. I made sure to be seen around town talking to people who remembered the rumors. I didn't say a word, but I made sure the right people knew. Then, I got the break I needed. I found an old interview with Victor from when he first moved to Tallinn. It seemed harmless at first, just him talking about how he'd found his calling as a dance instructor. But there was a detail in the article that caught my eye. He mentioned a past relationship that had been misunderstood. I dug deeper and found that the woman had left town suddenly, and rumors swirled around their falling out. There were whispers, but nothing concrete. That was the crack I needed. I knew exactly what to do with this. I reached out to an old contact in the press, someone who owed me a favor. I fed them enough of Victor's past to get them interested. Not too much, just enough to make them dig. Once they started asking questions, the story would start unraveling on its own. At the same time, I began talking to Liza's friends. I didn't confront them directly, but I started planting seeds of doubt. Comments about Victor's reputation, his history of manipulative behavior. I didn't say anything that would make them suspicious right away, but I wanted them to start thinking. The more I sowed those little doubts, the more I could watch her life begin to fracture. The final step was preparing an anonymous message that would shake Liza's world. A note containing a personal detail only her closest family and friends would recognize, one that would cast the affair in a new, darker light. It would make them question everything they knew about her. The woman they thought was perfect, the loving wife. Everything was coming together. The affair was just the start. I wasn't just going to expose the truth about her betrayal. I was going to destroy her image, piece by piece. Liza's perfect life, the one she'd worked so hard to build, would crumble. And Victor? He'd fall too. I wasn't just going to ruin him as the man who'd betrayed me, I was going to expose him as the manipulator he really was. Soon, they would both realize what it felt like to lose everything. The days dragged on, but I could feel everything shifting. Every step I took, every move I made, the walls around Liza's perfect world started to crack. She still had no idea what was coming, and Victor? He thought he was safe. But I could see it all now, like a slow-motion disaster. The sooner I set everything in motion, the better. I'd been working on this for weeks, laying the groundwork, planting seeds, making sure Victor's past began to surface. His misunderstood relationship from that old interview was starting to attract attention. It was subtle at first, but I knew the press would eventually take the bait. One small detail in his story would be enough to make people start asking questions. And once they did, everything would unravel. But Liza, she had no idea how close she was to losing everything. She was still playing the role of the perfect wife, the loving partner. I wasn't done yet, though. The next step was crucial, hitting her where it would hurt the most, her reputation. I spent hours drafting a message, carefully crafting it to be just personal enough to make her closest friends and family question everything. I chose a secret from our past, one that only a handful of people would recognize, and wrote it in a way that would make them wonder if they'd really known Liza at all. It had to be just cryptic enough to make them curious, but too dangerous for her to ignore. Liza's been lying to all of you for years. It's not just about Victor. There's more you don't know. More even you don't know. Ask her about it. Ask her about the past you've never seen. I hit send the next morning, watching the message leave my phone with a strange mix of satisfaction and anticipation. There was no going back now. I knew it would set things in motion. Her friends and family would start to question her, wonder about the woman they thought they knew. It didn't take long for the whispers to start. People close to her, friends I thought were loyal, were starting to act differently. Some reached out, asking vague questions about Liza. Others just kept their distance, sensing something was off. The first domino had fallen. Then came the press. The story about Victor's misunderstood relationship turned into a full-blown scandal. Once the press started digging, they uncovered more. His history wasn't just messy, it was dangerous. His manipulation, his deceit, it all came to light. Victor's reputation was collapsing, and with it, his perfect image as the charming dance instructor. I didn't need to expose them myself. I was the one behind the scenes, orchestrating everything, pulling strings. Watching Victor and Liza begin to crumble under the weight of their lies gave me a strange sense of satisfaction. I hadn't just been betrayed, I'd become the architect of their downfall. But this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. There was still much more to come. As Victor's reputation continued to collapse, I could feel the pressure building around Liza. Her friends, who I'd carefully planted seeds of doubt in, started acting differently. They didn't confront her outright, but their behavior had changed. It was subtle, but I could see it in the way they looked at her, the way they pulled away. At home, the atmosphere began to shift. Liza grew more nervous, like she could sense something was off but couldn't figure out where it was coming from. She began hesitating before speaking to me, trying to gauge if I knew. I played it cool, letting her feel the tension without ever letting her know where it was coming from. She thought she was still in control, but I could see the cracks forming in her perfect little world. The whispers, the changing attitudes, were taking their toll on her. But I wasn't done. Not yet. It was time to go after her in a more direct way. My next move was to target the image she had worked so hard to create, her carefully curated online persona. Liza's social media was the ultimate facade. Perfect pictures, perfect captions. She portrayed herself as a happy, successful woman, with the ideal family and a loving husband. But behind that image, I knew the truth. I knew the lies she'd told to maintain the illusion of perfection. It was time to tear that down. I started small, posting a few old photos of her, subtly edited to suggest something darker beneath the surface. I didn't need to be obvious. A well-placed, compromised image here and there would do the job. I showed her with Victor in more intimate settings, but not overtly sexual, just enough to make people question their relationship. These small hints planted the idea that maybe she wasn't the woman everyone thought she was. It wasn't just about revealing the affair. It was about slowly unraveling the carefully constructed narrative she'd spent years building. I used her own words against her, quotes from old posts and captions that I twisted into something manipulative, something that painted her as calculating and deceitful. The more I posted, the more her online life began to unravel. Her friends started to take notice. At first, it was just a few, an old friend, a cousin. But the whispers spread, and soon others began to question her. They began to distance themselves, unsure of who she really was. I made sure to keep pushing the narrative, keeping the pressure on without ever giving myself away. It wasn't long before her perfect world began to crack. People were questioning her, her relationships, and the life she'd carefully built. Her social media was flooded with comments of disbelief. Her friends were pulling back, and the pressure was starting to suffocate her. She didn't know where the attacks were coming from, but I was watching, enjoying every moment as her image crumbled. But I wasn't finished yet. There was still one more strike left, one final blow to make sure she'd never be able to pick up the pieces of her life again. By now, Victor's reputation was in ruins. His past had been dragged into the light, and people were turning on him. But Liza's world was still hanging by a thread. Her friends were starting to ask questions, but she managed to keep a few close. Her carefully built life wasn't completely shattered yet. That's when I knew it was time for the final blow. It wasn't enough to just expose the affair or ruin Victor. I had to destroy the core of who Liza was, completely unravel everything she'd built. And I wasn't going to confront her directly. I needed something that would leave her with nothing, a public revelation that would tear apart her entire image. I had everything I needed. I'd spent days collecting every secret, every lie Liza had carefully hidden. Now, I was going to turn it into a story that would destroy her in the eyes of the public. I sent an anonymous tip to a tabloid journalist I trusted, one I knew would turn it into something huge. The tip was simple but loaded with potential. Liza's affair is just the beginning. There's more to her than you think. You've only scratched the surface. Within hours, I started hearing buzz. The journalist was on it. The interview would be framed as an inside source, someone with intimate knowledge of Liza's double life. It wasn't just going to reveal the affair, it was going to expose everything. I made sure the article painted Liza as a manipulator, a woman who'd built her perfect life on lies and deceit. When the article dropped, it was explosive. Liza wasn't just someone who'd cheated with Victor. She was painted as a woman who had been playing everyone for years. The story framed her as someone who used Victor as a pawn, who orchestrated her betrayal with a cold, calculated mind. It wasn't just an affair, it was a calculated manipulation of everyone around her. The article went viral. Liza's social media exploded with messages of disbelief, anger, and betrayal. Friends started reaching out to me, some apologizing for not seeing it sooner. Others distanced themselves from her entirely. Her closest friends blocked her on social media, and family members started questioning everything. The life she'd spent years building came crashing down in a matter of hours. The best part? It was all true. I'd known the truth all along. Liza had been living a lie, and now the world knew it. She had spent years building a perfect facade, and in an instant, it had all crumbled. I watched it all unfold, feeling a sense of satisfaction I hadn't expected. This wasn't just revenge, it was the truth coming to light. Liza's perfect image was gone. The world no longer saw her as the loving wife and devoted mother. They saw her for what she really was. A manipulator, a liar, someone who thought she could deceive everyone without consequences. And for the first time in months, I felt the weight lift. The game was over. The next few days were a blur, but in the most satisfying way. Liza's life, once so carefully crafted, was unraveling right before my eyes. It wasn't just the press or the public humiliation, it was the look on her face when the truth started to sink in. She was cornered, and she knew it. But she didn't know the full extent of what had happened. She had no idea I was the one pulling all the strings. Liza came home that night, her face pale, her eyes red. She was on the phone with someone, probably her lawyer or one of her friends who still hadn't fully turned on her. She didn't even look at me when she walked past. I knew the affair had already broken her, but the floodgates had only just opened. She hadn't even begun to feel the full weight of everything. I didn't confront her right away. I didn't need to. Her downfall was happening, piece by piece, and she couldn't stop it. She tried to fight it, of course. She tried to control the narrative, reach out to the people who mattered most to her, but it was too late. The damage was already done. It was almost cruel, how quickly everything slipped from her grasp. Her phone was buzzing constantly, messages from people she'd once trusted, asking her about the article. Some called her a liar to her face, while others cut all contact without a word. Her social media was a battlefield. Angry comments, accusations, messages of disgust. She'd gone from being the charming, perfect wife to the woman everyone whispered about in disgust. But Liza was trying to put on a brave face. She tried to act like she could still control the situation, that somehow this would blow over. But I could see the cracks, the way she stumbled over her words, the way she avoided certain people. She was still trying to play the part of the loving wife, but I knew it wouldn't last. Not when her whole world was falling apart. What really stung, though, was how she started to turn on everyone around her. She blamed Victor, of course, calling him a manipulative bastard, the one who'd ruined everything. But she didn't take responsibility for any of it. There was no admission of guilt, no regret. She was still playing the victim, as if the whole thing wasn't her own doing. I wanted to confront her, to say everything I'd been holding back, but I didn't need to. I had already won. The world saw her for what she was, a liar, a manipulator. She had no more control, no more perfect image. Her life was scattered in pieces, and I was content to watch the fallout. I was done with the games. Liza would never get back what she'd lost. She thought she could have it all. She thought she could deceive everyone and get away with it. But she couldn't. Not anymore. For the first time in a long time, I felt free. The days following the article were strange, like I was watching a train wreck in slow motion. Liza's life, once so carefully constructed, was falling apart. She wasn't the perfect wife or mother anymore. She was a woman exposed, her lies and manipulations unraveling for everyone to see. She tried to put out the flames, calling her friends, desperately pleading that it was all a misunderstanding. But no one believed her. Those who were once closest to her distanced themselves. Her family, who'd always supported her, suddenly looked the other way. I had made sure of that. Every attempt to salvage her reputation made her look more pathetic. She wasn't fooling anyone. I didn't confront her. There was no point. The damage was already done. She didn't need me to add to her misery. She was doing a good job of it herself. Watching her flounder was almost painful, seeing the way she tried to hold up this mask of the perfect wife, while the world around her saw the cracks. Her desperation only made it worse. What struck me wasn't the betrayal. It was how little Liza seemed to feel the weight of her actions. She wasn't begging for forgiveness. She wasn't owning up to anything. Instead, she spent hours on the phone with her lawyer, trying to minimize the fallout. She blamed Victor for everything, claiming he manipulated her. But the truth was, she'd made her own choices, and deep down, she knew it. The guilt in her eyes spoke volumes, but she wouldn't admit it. She couldn't. Liza tried to control the narrative, but it was too late. The public had already turned on her. She was no longer the victim. She was the manipulator, the liar. The more she tried to cover up her mistakes, the more people saw through her. Her social media was a battlefield. The posts that once showcased a perfect life were now bombarded with angry comments, accusations of betrayal. Her perfect image had been shattered, and it was happening right in front of her. People started asking, how long had she been living this lie? How much of what she showed the world was fake? Her career wasn't safe either. Liza had always been respected in her field, but now that respect was gone. She wasn't the woman people turned to for advice anymore. She was the woman who'd ruined everything. Her colleagues avoided her, her reputation disintegrating faster than she could salvage it. I watched all of it unfold with a strange detachment. For so long, I'd imagined this moment of triumph, thinking it would bring me peace. But it didn't. It left me empty. Liza had gotten what she deserved, but seeing her fall apart didn't feel like victory. It just made me realize how little I cared for her now. I was free from the betrayal, but I didn't know what came next. The world had seen Liza for who she really was, but I was left with the pieces of my own life, trying to figure out what came after the destruction. The days stretched on, and I found myself in a strange limbo. Liza's life was in ruins, but somehow, it didn't feel like a victory. Sure, she was paying for what she did, but the satisfaction I thought I'd get from her downfall was missing. It felt hollow. She wasn't coming home at night anymore, too ashamed or maybe just too lost to face me. Either way, she was consumed by the aftermath. She spent her days trying to fix things, dodging calls and attempting to salvage her name, but it was already too late. The truth had spread too far. People were already talking about the affair, about me, about everything. What stung wasn't just the public fallout. It was watching her when we were alone. Liza used to be confident, always in control, sure of herself. But now she was a ghost. She hardly ate or slept, and when she did speak, her words seemed hollow, empty. The woman I thought I knew had been swallowed whole by the lies she'd built. I started to feel like an outsider in my own house, and I couldn't help but wonder if I'd been blind all those years. Had I missed the signs? A part of me hated her for what she did to me, but another part hated myself for not seeing it sooner. How could I have been so blind? One night, I found her sitting in the kitchen, staring at nothing. She didn't hear me come in. For a moment, I almost felt pity for her. But then she looked at me, and I saw that coldness in her eyes, the same coldness that had always been there beneath the surface. She wasn't sorry. She was just trying to figure out how to survive the mess she'd made. "You don't have to do this, Liza," I said quietly, more tired than angry. She gave a bitter laugh, her voice sharp. "Do what, Richard? You've already destroyed everything. What's left?" It hit me then. She was still playing the victim, still trying to deflect responsibility. But it didn't matter. The foundation of our marriage was broken. The lies she'd lived with, the betrayal she'd caused, it was too late to fix anything. "I just want you to admit it," I said. "Not to me. Not to anyone else. But to yourself. To face what you did." She looked at me, a mixture of defiance and defeat in her eyes. Then she stood up, walked past me without a word, and left the room. I didn't chase after her. There was nothing left to say. The truth was, even if she apologized or begged for forgiveness, it wouldn't change a thing. I had already seen her for who she really was, and that version of Liza couldn't be undone. I had gotten what I wanted, the truth came out, she was exposed, but somehow it felt like I'd lost something too. My peace, my ability to trust, was gone. Even though she had betrayed me, I was the one left picking up the pieces. And in the end, that was the hardest part. The house was unnervingly quiet after she left. At first, it felt like an empty space where her presence had once been constant. I didn't know what to do with myself. There was no anger left to fuel me, no sense of victory or triumph. Just an overwhelming emptiness. It wasn't relief. It wasn't closure. It was just silence. I didn't reach out to Liza, and she didn't reach out to me. She was too busy scrambling to pick up the pieces of her own life. The world was already seeing her for who she was. There was no need for more explanations, more lies. What she'd done was clear to everyone. In those first days, I didn't try to make sense of anything. I didn't try to fix myself or the house or the wreckage. I just existed in the quiet. It wasn't until a week had passed that I started to move, slowly. It wasn't about moving on, because there was no shortcut through this. It was about simply moving forward, even if just by a step at a time. I started with small things, cleaning the house, organizing the mess we'd accumulated. I threw out old photos, things that reminded me of better times. It wasn't about erasing her, but about taking back my space, my life. The house felt less like hers and more like mine with each passing day. I didn't want to dwell on what I had lost. Our history, the years spent together, they couldn't be reclaimed. But I wasn't going to live in that space forever. I started seeing friends again. People I hadn't seen in years, people I had pushed away when I'd been caught up in my own world with Liza. They didn't ask many questions. They just showed up. That was enough. Some days, the weight of the betrayal still hung heavy. I'd see something, a picture, a memory, and the loss would hit me all over again. The life I thought I had, the trust one thought was unbreakable, it was all gone. But I couldn't keep living in that place. I couldn't let her take up all the space in my mind, in my life. I spent more time alone, rediscovering who I was without her. I picked up hobbies I'd neglected, went to the gym more, even joined a book club. These weren't big changes, but they were steps, signs that I was moving forward. Slowly, I began to reclaim the pieces of myself I'd lost in the years of pretending everything was fine. The hardest part wasn't the public fallout. It was the quiet moments at night, lying in bed, when the weight of it all would hit me. The ache of her absence. I wasn't angry anymore. I was just tired. But even those moments started to fade. The ghosts of her that haunted the house lessened, like memories that drift away with time. One evening, as I walked through the kitchen, I realized I hadn't thought about her all day. The weight in my chest wasn't as heavy anymore. It wasn't that I'd forgotten her or forgiven her. It was that I was finally accepting what had happened. The house was mine again, my life was mine again, and even if it wasn't perfect, it was real. And for the first time in months, that felt enough. The world didn't stop when Liza left. People still went about their daily lives, the noise of the outside world pressing in as if nothing had changed. But everything had changed. I had changed. I wasn't sure how to keep going, how to find a way forward. Every corner of the house seemed to whisper her name. Her favorite coffee mug was still on the counter, the one she always used in the mornings. Her shoes were scattered by the door, as if she might come home any minute. But she wasn't coming home. I spent the first few weeks just trying to make sense of what had happened. The betrayal, the affair, the lies. They were a wrecking ball to my entire life. I had built a world around her, and now I was standing in the ruins. The question swirled. Why didn't I see it? Was I that blind? How long had she been living this double life? But no answers came. All I had were the pieces of a life I thought I knew, scattered around me. And slowly, I realized the only thing I could do was start picking them up. It wasn't about finding closure. It was about finding peace. I started with the small stuff. I cleared out her things, her clothes, her makeup, her books, anything that still felt like it belonged to her. It wasn't about erasing her. It was about reclaiming my space. I wasn't going to be reminded of the lies every time I turned around. I didn't go looking for sympathy. I didn't want anyone's pity or judgment. But I did find comfort in the people who had stuck around. My friends. They didn't ask me a million questions. They didn't need all the details. They just let me be. But even with their support, the silence at night was the hardest part. That's when the loneliness hit me hardest. The hours when I had nothing but my own thoughts. And yet, in those moments, I started to realize something. As much as I missed the person Liza used to be, I didn't miss the woman who had betrayed me. The woman who had shattered everything we had. I began to feel a strange sense of freedom. For the first time in ages, I wasn't living under someone else's shadow. I could do whatever I wanted. I could rebuild not just my life but myself. It wouldn't be easy. Nothing worth rebuilding ever is. But I could choose to start again. I began seeing a therapist, not to relive the details of the affair, but to talk about what it meant to live after the fallout. To learn how to trust again, not just others but myself. I found new hobbies, picked up old interests. I even traveled for a bit. Small trips, just to get out of my own head, to remember that there was more to the world than betrayal. The hardest part wasn't rebuilding. It was letting go. Letting go of the life I had imagined, the future I thought was mine. But slowly, that future started to look different. And for the first time in a long time, I began to see a path ahead of me that wasn't defined by the pain of the past. Life would never be the same. I knew that. But for the first time in months, I started to feel like I could make it mine again. Months had passed, but the weight of everything still hit me out of nowhere. The betrayal, the lies. It never fully left. There were moments when I thought I could forget, but then something, a song, a couple laughing, would remind me of what had happened. Liza hadn't contacted me in weeks. I didn't expect her to. There was nothing left to say. But then one evening, her name flashed on my phone. I hesitated before answering. Part of me wanted to ignore it, but another part needed to hear what she had to say. Richard, her voice was shaky. "Can we talk?" I agreed, though I wasn't sure I wanted to hear it. I needed answers, but I wasn't expecting any relief. She came the next day. The house felt empty now, her absence more noticeable than ever. She looked different, smaller, like she was barely holding it together. We sat in silence before she spoke. "I never meant for any of this," she said, her voice low. "I never meant to hurt you." I didn't know what to say. Her apology felt too little, too late. "I'm sorry," she added, looking down. "I thought I could keep it all under control. I was selfish." "You didn't think about me," I replied, keeping my voice steady. "You didn't think about us. You just kept taking until there was nothing left." She flinched. "I know. I was lost, trying to feel something. It wasn't about you. It was just me." "I don't need you to explain it," I said. "I don't need you to fix this. It's over. We're over." Her face crumpled as she realized the finality of it. "I know," she whispered. She stood to leave, and I didn't stop her. No dramatic confrontation. No emotional goodbye. It was just done. As she walked out the door, I felt calm. Not relief, not closure, but acceptance. There was nothing left to fix. No point in holding on to what was broken. It was over, and for the first time, I felt like I could move on. After Liza left, the house felt like a shell, stripped of everything familiar. I spent the first few days just processing, too numb to do much, but not ready to let go of the life I'd built. The quiet was deafening. I'd sit in the living room, staring at the empty space where we used to sit together, trying to figure out what came next. There was no guidebook for this, no clear path. At first, it was easy to get lost in the details. Picking up her things, closing her social media accounts, sorting through everything she'd left behind. I guess it was part of the healing, but I didn't really feel it at the time. Every task felt like another thing to check off, another way to erase her from my life. I tried to focus on small things, like getting back into a routine. I went for runs in the mornings, cooked meals for myself, something I hadn't done in years. It was a kind of distraction, but it helped. Slowly, I started to feel the weight lifting. Not all at once, but piece by piece. I also reconnected with friends I hadn't seen in a while. Real friends, the ones who hadn't disappeared when things got hard. They didn't judge. They didn't ask questions. They just showed up when I needed them. We'd go out for drinks, talk about random stuff, and in those moments, I remembered what it felt like to laugh again. But even with the support, the loneliness still crept in. Some nights, it was almost unbearable. I missed the intimacy we used to share. The small gestures, the way she would kiss me goodbye in the morning, the way we'd talk about our day. But that intimacy was gone now, replaced by the knowledge of her betrayal. And I had to remind myself constantly. I didn't want that version of her back. The woman who lied to me, who betrayed my trust, wasn't someone I could love again. The hardest part was the emptiness. The silence at night when I lay awake, unable to sleep. But as weeks turned into months, I started to notice a shift. I wasn't waiting for her anymore. I wasn't hoping she'd come back or that she'd apologize in some grand way. I realized I could make my own decisions. I wasn't defined by her mistakes, by what she had done to me. Eventually, I started seeing a therapist, not to get answers from the past, but to move forward, to understand how I could rebuild. I wasn't just healing from a marriage ending. I was healing from the version of myself that had been consumed by it. It was a long road, but with each step, I started to feel more like myself. I wasn't angry anymore, and that was something. The hurt would always be there, but I was starting to see a future where it didn't define me. I had been through the worst of it, and if I could survive that, I knew I could handle whatever came next. Liza's betrayal didn't take away who I was. It didn't take away my ability to find happiness, or love, or peace. In time, I realized that what I had lost wasn't everything. What I had now was a chance to rebuild, this time, on my own terms.